Okay, welcome everyone. We are very pleased to welcome you here to discuss a project that has a very, very long gestation. 10 years before today, exactly, we convened a workshop at University of Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology to discuss something about to discuss gender justice or lack thereof. You all had the description of the symposium that I hope would give you some sense of direction as to where we are going with this. So since you have the description, I will just go straight to my comments. Although I am extremely saddened by Rosemary's loss, I think that I'm going to have some leeway in trying to cover in depth some of the issues that we are trying to talk. I had initially 20 minutes, now I think 40 minutes. Okay, finding spaces for fairness. Serious reckoning with gender must be fully cognizant of arguments against its conflation with women. Jane Flax remarks, and I quote, "Gender relations enter into every aspect of human experience. Turn the experience of gender relations for any person and the structure of gender as a social category are shaped by the interaction of gender relations and other social relations such as race and class. Gender relations thus have no fixed essence. They vary both within and over time," unquote. While avoiding essentialism, we contend that women are central to the questions of power, its exercise, and the myriad forms of mitigation and resistance in the specific gendered milieu in which they are enacted. Political theorist Mona Abulfadl observes that the woman question has generally been assumed to be a question of ascertaining/affirming women's rights and liberating women from the yoke of systemic oppression, which keep them subordinated to the tyranny of men, an oppression made possible by an order of society sanctioning male domination and qualified as patriarchal. This argument is particularly relevant to Muslim societies in spite of their variations and multiplicities. Key philosophical positions vis-à-vis the nature of gendered practices in the context of particular socio-political histories and cultural experiences by and large revolve around this fundamental premise. Since we position the woman question squarely within the culture and politics of gender justice, we must acknowledge that at the outset, the momentous work that has been done on its historical and cultural contextualization. The prominent thinkers of the Arab cultural renaissance persistently engaged the woman question in Muslim societies and situated it comparatively and politically within Islamic and non-Islamic frameworks. Especially significant are those whose engagements with the French context are exemplified in their espousal of elements with the French context, of elements of Charles de Montesquieu arguments on the nature of freedom, advance in l'esprit de loi. Imam Muhammad Abdu, Rufa' al-Tahtawi, the Imam in Paris, Tahir al-Haddad, Abdurrahman al-Kawakbi, and Qasim Amin, among others, occupied themselves with the cultural and political embeddedness of equality and freedom and questioned the claims of legitimation of violence in the name of tradition and religion that were constantly conflated by polemicists who saw themselves as proprietors of juridical interpretations. Faraj bin Ramadan, who illuminates a strong materialist current in the thinking of Tahtawis vis-a-vis women's emancipation, expertly describes the strong yearnings for renewal in Arab Renaissance philosophy. His invitation to liberate women from systemic and interlocking modes of oppression was indexical to his dreams of a just society that afforded women equality of opportunity at both material and moral levels. Many have agreed that religious interpretations were not doctrine-based absolutes, but relational modes of reading texts. And they link the very practice of meaning creation to deeper analytical contexts and forces of modernity. While the historical processes of the internationalization and the institutionalization of women's Renaissance discourse cannot be summed up quickly, it is important to begin with Ben Ramadan's contention that the search for answers to the predicaments of inequality and injustice should be located within a shared space of intersecting ideas that unite the materiality of reformist demands for change. These questions compels us to probe the structural constraints that institutionalize practices of marginalization, subordination, and inequity. Although clarifying the ambiguities of gender justice entails enormous challenges, the rootedness of gender justice in anthropological, historical, political, sociological, and legal domains that provide multiple ways of contemplating particularity within universality make this framework especially promising. Reading the ethnographic and historical work that captures the most intimate predicaments in the lives of women in diverse localities of the Muslim world is critical for illuminating the ways in which women can subvert the silences and transgressions as rise as major actors in transformed societies. Martha Nussbaum has put forward significant philosophical contribution to the debate. In proposing a new approach to social justice, she argues, quote, "The central questions asked by the capabilities approach is not how satisfied is this woman, or even how much in the way of resources is she able to command. It is instead what is actually able to do and to be." End of quote. The question as to how we can locate a space for fairness that defies the natural order of things is one which warrants systematic explications. Let me start transition into an important debate about how we explicate the predicament of women between tradition and modernity. In order to decipher the fine print that accompanies such a concatenation of complex subjects, this workshop attempts to probe notions of self and society that bear centrally on the idea of fairness within locally specific histories and difficult dialogues that arise with respect to women's rights, relationality, patriarchy, and dominance in Islamic politics and cultures. Why are discussions of the women question almost always situated within a polarized frame of tradition and modernity versus modernity? What effect does the divide between modernity and tradition have on women who are seen to embody it? How can we understand the concept of tradition as it relates to Muslim societies today? How would policies affecting the institutionalization of gender justice change if the very questions of gender politics, traditions, and Islam were examined from a more comprehensive perspective that illuminates the dynamism of these socio-political forces without resorting to reductive forms of knowledge? What specific internal and external factors lead to the constant propagation and intervention of tradition? In what ways do representations of these traditions in the West lead to increased radicalization and resistance to alternate explanations of gender politics? Do Muslim women really need saving? Anthropological reflections on cultural relativisms and its others, Leila Boulougoud analyzes the increasingly radicalization of tradition, and I cite her. The discussion of culture, veiling, and how one can navigate the shoals of cultural difference once should be put Laura Bush's self-congratulations about the rejoicing of Afghan women liberated by American troops in a different light. It is deeply problematic to construct the Afghan woman as someone in need of saving. When you save someone, you imply that you are saving her from something. You are also saving her to something. What violences are entailed in this transformation? And what presumptions are being made about the superiority of that to which we are saving her? That is a long quote, but I loved it. Boulougoud discusses this problematic in light of a much deeper analysis of a representational discourse that she aptly titles The Rhetoric of Salvation. Cognizant of the theoretical and methodological implications of the rhetoric of salvation, this workshop hopes to expand the discussion of gender justice beyond widely held oppositional frames, most significantly beyond narratives of victimization and suffering. In this task, we must acknowledge the tenacity of the representation of gender as it relates to the status of women in diverse Muslim societies as primarily an outcome of deeply entrenched conflict between tradition and modernity. Why? In a powerful essay titled The Tradition Effect, Framing Honor Crimes in Turkey, sociologist Dicle Kugulu sees the question of tradition as situated within the intersection of multiple political and social dynamics. Her analysis of the mobilization of tradition elaborates on local and translocal linkages and dovetails with several underlying arguments articulated and yet to be articulated in this workshop. Excavating gender justice is interested interested in shifting the predominant paradigm by explaining the diverse and critical uses of tradition and by contextualizing gender justice within local, national, and international politics. This approach demonstrates that gender justice in Islamic understandings cannot be mapped onto mainstream binary oppositions. It forces us to interrogate those very categories and examine the ways in which they were imported into non-Western societies in the first place. Yeah. What is your preference? Shall I just continue finishing my paper or stop here? In Arab societies, the problem of tradition versus modernity that seems to be such a persistent dilemma did not emerge until colonial wars swept the region and prompted the wedding of the notion of tradition to issues of identity and subjectivity. In The Assassination of the Mind, the trouble of Arab culture beyond fundamentalism and dependency, Burhan Ghalioun puts his finger on the pulse of the massive insecurities that grew out of political defeat when he tells us that as tradition and modernity were made to lock horns, analysis fell short and creative spaces for critique shrank as these terms metamorphosed into a bare dichotomy. The vitality of culture was suffocated as all that stands for change came under attack as an emblem of surrender. He shows how the dispute between tradition and modernity was structured by both internal and external dynamics, surrounding the obliteration of dialogues within Arab culture when constituencies were coerced to define their position vis-à-vis the West. Supporters of tradition trapped themselves in the past, while advocates of modernity laid claim to the future. Because of the marriage of tradition and religion, modernity surfaced as a crisis and the source of splits. Foremost among the many social consequences of this opposition was the fact that women came to embody the nation, both in its euphoric times of triumph and its demoralizing moments of defeat. We can push this argument further by drawing a powerful analogy with anthropologist Veena Das' examination of the interlocking notion of woman and nation as seen through the lens of the political and social contract. Veena Das goes beyond a focus on violence, though it's of paramount significance to the egregious abrogation of justice. She relates it to the very question of femininity and masculinity as social constructs, germinal to apprehending the interlacing of the political and the domestic. And I think that will take me back to Asma Halim's later, the culture is violent. If we bring Burhan Ghalioun in dialogue with Veena Das, I just imagine them sitting in the table on a couch, and what would they say to each other? We see the intimacy and violence are inextricable. Das explains this connection in the exclusion of women and invites us to reflect on the conditions under which women come to be included as certain kinds of sexed citizens within the political community. The utility of this approach for thinking more broadly about grave injustices on account of sexual difference will be demonstrated through, I think, in this discussion and beyond as we push further. Epistemologically, tradition has been approached from different angles that range significantly in their level of abstraction, but converge on the idea of authenticity and fidelity to the past, all its good and evil, oppressive and overwhelmingly as it was. Raymond Williams' formidable keywords put forward the idea of tradition as surrender. Others have explained it as akin to the object of devotion. Coming to terms with tradition is not easy. It is imperative to explore ways of looking at it as a complex, highly differentiated set of ideas that were handed down and accepted as red lines that ought not be crossed regardless of the particular circumstances. In Muslim societies, there are numerous interpretations of the meaning of tradition, ranging from extremist and fundamentalist to more moderate views. Society has been changing in such a fashion that it behooved the oppressed to stare tradition in the face and demand its dismantling as a relic of the past that justified belonging but subjected them to egregious agony and violence. As we focus here in this workshop our attention to gender justice, we see that historically the invention and reinvention of tradition have always centered on their own bodies. Indeed, women's bodies are sites upon which cultures are inscribed and boundaries redrawn. The multiple meanings and mobilizations of tradition have to be thoroughly examined to comprehend the predicament of gender justice, which, though dealt with at various spheres of abstraction, in one which needs attention, nowhere has this problem presented itself in a more convoluted yet consequential way than when tradition is converted into the core of national identity and invoked in nationalist discourses that wittingly or unwittingly turn a blind eye on discrimination and marginalization. At particular historical junctures, the conflation of women with nation led to heated colonial encounters about female circumcision, for example, in colonial Sudan. Historian Abdullahi Ali Ibrahim's work revisits, for example, the 1946 Rufa'a revolt by Ustaz Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, the Islamic modernist reformer, who was executed by President Jafar Nimeri in 1986 to abolish legislation against female circumcision imposed by the British. Although revered as a martyr for his courage in facing death for his beliefs, Ustaz Mahmoud Muhammad Taha has been unrelentingly castigated for opposing a measure that intended to rescue women from their barbarous custom. Not even Taha's subsequent unprecedented labor for women's rights took the edge of criticism of his stand on circumcision in 1946. Abdullah Ibrahim argues that this conflicted view about Taha's feminist legacy arose from an unfortunate dichotomy in scholarship about the Sudan. The culturally sensitive feminist writings about female circumcision that originated in the country have failed to influence the narrative of Sudanese nationalism. In this narrative, colonial modernity's claims to civilizing the natives, including rescuing indigenous women from their male oppressors, has been widely accepted. Worse still, both scholars and citizens who were distressed by the disarray of independent Sudan nostalgically remember this rescue mission as a golden past. The extent to which broader political and socio-cultural trends affect gender justice through the reinforcement of traditions, especially those are harmful to the cause of women's rights, has been critical to theorizing the boundary of private and public, a notion that pervaded approaches to the question of women in diverse human societies. The topics we are going to address here hopefully will tackle these issues with respect to the decision-making processes, the legal foundation of justice, the explication of the entanglements of justice within larger debates of religious interpretations and practices as a point of departure and also a plea for understanding. I will try to be very, so that I can give people the opportunity also to read their papers. But my paper here goes on to talk about several themes. One of the themes is also a question: how do we locate the parameters of gender justice? If interested, let me know and I can share. In casting a wide net on the literature on gender justice, tradition, religion, and fairness, we encounter authors who have begun to disentangle the culture and politics of tradition and modernity. Hamid Nasser Abu Zaid, Allah yarhamu, Circles of Fear, Dawa'ir al-Khawf, a reading into the discourse, revisits debates on the woman question in Muslim societies. Ahmad Suway'iyya wrote a fantastic book called Contesting Justice, Women, Islam, and the Law, demonstrates the centrality of interpretation. The significance of Nasr Ahmad Abu Zaid's extraordinary work extends beyond the philosophical and political confrontations with religious authority in his native Egypt. By interlacing genealogies of interpretations within the anthropology of language, he reveals the effacement of the social as a missing dimension in religious discourses on women's gendered identities. And winding down, hopefully. Oh, so I have time to, okay. Okay, so we will go back to some ideas that we hope to elaborate, as I said, to why are we still having these debates 10 years later after the initial conversation about how we excavate gender justice. Gender justice engaging these theoretical and practical concerns by reflecting on a plethora of ethnographic and political factors to problematize questions of political representation. Delving into the history and politics of gender reform, for example, provides further validation of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's declaration that women's equality is advanced when we educate women like men. And to inverted commas. Connected epistemology to praxis will then unfold as the ultimate harvest of social debates relevant to legal and political anthropology, citizenship, equity, and rights and entitlements. Ethnographers and practitioners advanced, for example, in the work of Ewa Ong, which I put in for description, drew upon strikingly new perspectives. I asked Hassan al-Rahmouni, who was the governor of Casablanca, in a conversation at what time, for 6 years. I said, how do you see the subject of gender justice from your vantage points as a supreme judicial and executive person in Morocco? Question. His response explained to me the practical steps undertaken recently at that point in the conversation by the Moroccan government to promote gender balance in the public realm by removing legal barriers in previous personal family codes that in effect confined women to making decisions only in the private realm. He went on to talk about Al-Mudawwana, so if anybody is interested in Al-Mudawwana, we can talk about it some more. The incredible body of work as evidenced in the literature and as to be expanded in our conversation today is important not only for pinpointing a problem of tradition versus modernity, but also for offering practical solutions to deeply entrenched quandaries. This workshop, then, is not intended to silence conversations on tradition and modernity, but it aspires to reformulate the problem by not treating either tradition or modernity as isolates in a globalized world. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, let me, I skipped a lot, but I will go to the searching for promising foundations of gender justice. Occasions arose, and this is one of them, to conduct inquiries about the meanings and potentialities of gender justice in numerous feminist fora, in Qatar, in Tunisia, in Sudan, Egypt, elsewhere in the world. From women of Birzeit, Palestine, Kenya, I learned a great deal in conversation about the problematic of agitation for reproductive rights, for example, one area of gender justice that we can kick up a notch here. To them, in both places, the law's force lies in its effectiveness in counteracting the conservative views of clerics who often intervene whenever attempts to improve women's lives are initiated. In Tunisia, for example, Kausar, the Center of Arab Women for Training and Research, under the leadership of Soukaina Bouraoui, Madame Sepsi. Sepsis is a fantastic family. And the lawyer, she's also a lawyer, redefined the parameters of gender justice by organizing efforts of the media to reshape gender politics. And media broadly defined, from little handouts here and there, reaching out throughout Tunisia to try to put the point across. The diversity as well as the intensity of these debates surrounding justice is similar to those generated by the phrase human rights. Gender justice conjoins two terms, each of which represents a field of study in and of itself, and must be positioned within particular histories accounting for philosophical, legal, institution, and frames of reference once referenced as contextually mediated forces. Searching for local frameworks, this is my last paragraph, بالمناسبة. Searching for local frameworks for gender justice is crucial to strengthening the public culture in social environment and the social environment conducive to sustainable change. The achievements recounted in my comments, as well as your comments to come, again, will hopefully invoke the past to perpetuate perpetuated injustice and to try to serve as examples of promising ways forward.
Thank you, Rogaia, for the stimulating paper. To go back to the framing of the subject into traditional modernity and to seek a parameter, as you mentioned, to realize or to dig out a sense of gender justice in our region, it is not an easy question. It is not an easy question to find an answer for it, because when we talk about gender justice, we are talking about everything. We are talking about the political structure, we talk about the economic structure, we talk about the legal structure, we talk about the cultural structure, we talk about global governance. So it is not really related only to tradition and modernity. And when we talk about the general structures governing what is the meaning and what are the processes to achieve gender justice, we are talking about deep changes within each society and deep changes between societies and between two systems of power governing now the world, in the sense that in an age of eroding the concept of sovereignty, of a sovereign national state, to what extent constructing the new woman into the project of a nation state is relevant now in the age of globalization. Because if I take, for example from our own context, as I'm going to talk about it tomorrow, when you are overwhelmed by all forms of violence coming from a colonial power, and you have mediums of global governance forcing you only to deal and solve issues related to domestic violence. So this will take us back to what extent, the national sovereign is really relevant in achieving gender justice, So we are talking here about, as I said, so many structures, local, regional, especially here, when I talk about regional, I look at the influence of a country like Saudi Arabia on this country in particular. So we are talking about, local powers, we are talking about regional powers, we are talking about global powers. So I think this might help us to widen our horizon on how and under what circumstances, globally, regionally, locally, and internally, of course, can we achieve gender justice. And gender justice here, I see it as a long series of processes, in which women are not a captive, victim at all. Because when we deal about theoretical framing of how can we achieve gender justice, and we talk about all these forms of structures, let us not to forget women's agency too. You know, women's agency in the sense, if we talk about the gendered self, you know, the gendered self, this need to be contextualized in our societies, that this gendered self is not the individualized, you know, Western self that is, you know, independent or autonomous from any other influences. Even in the West, there is a critique for that. So here, you know, when we talk about women's autonomous self, we need to theorize what do we mean exactly, and if this autonomous self is totally independent from the family, from the bigger family, from the community, from, you know, so we need here to problematize also women's agency, and in the middle of this concept of agency, what do we mean by the gendered autonomous self in our context? And I stop here, and we can maybe take some other.
May I respond directly or stay? Yeah, this is great, and of course, when we talk, there are two things that came to mind when you were talking about women's agency. Of course, by now, common knowledge that agency itself is not an absolute, that it is also subject to some interlocking politics and histories and one class and race and gender, as we have seen from the accumulation of work by Black feminists, for example, in the US, books, Angela Davis, Bill Collins, and others, that you don't exist outside just as a sex body. You are also a gendered citizen. You are also a raced and classed person. So within that, agency itself is not just an absolute reality in which I can do whatever I want. And here I think Isaiah Berlin's notions of positive and negative liberty can play into our discussion in expanding that. So you're absolutely right, there are always limitations, because there is no independent ontology called woman that stands outside of the realm of the political and the social. Your comment about the sovereign and the national, I think it stands to distinction. Okay, sometimes they conflate, sometimes you have to look at the sovereign as something that is completely different from the national. But at times, as I said, that is why it's such a muddled question. There are situations when somebody wrote about how we become sovereign when we subscribe to a notion of sovereignty as organized hypocrisy. And then there are other situations where I am totally free, totally. I am my own person. But again, there are constraints coming from all different directions, even if you want to be a sovereign subject. So these are very important. But let's say that there is a subject called the national sovereign subject. And the changes, the broader changes that you called for, we just go back to the very basic facets of how change takes place, right? The time has to be right, the space has to be right. And also, we have to appreciate from whose perspective are we talking about actually change is important for me. This is not to reduce, for example, women who love the status quo and to say, oh, I am a proud home mom, stay home mom. There is an agency in that. But if read, as I said, from the body of literature that is coming from outside, this person who decides to stay home on her own volition, free volition, is not looking at somebody who is a sovereign subject. She's a subordinate. And that is what we need to critique, that when people make decisions based on the evaluation and the assessment of their own circumstance, how do they fit into this tradition and modernity in a literature that is actually imposed. And I will even push further to say that the overwhelming kind of emphasis on tradition and modernity, and that is why it resurfaces in all of our discussion, is that most of these discussions are coming from without, right? So most of it is actually knowledge generated about Muslim women are coming from without, not so much from within. And so I welcome your comment that the time is ripe to try to actually theorize our own subjectivities in relation to space and time and perspective.
I think it's again relevant to look from the perspective of tradition, modernity, but then we have to acknowledge that there are different traditions and whose tradition we are talking about. As you know, I have studied South Yemen since very long time, and yeah, there is. Yeah.
We have a very bad room, so basically you're going to have to, we tried our best to make this room usable. You need to place the microphone in such a way that it's not too close and not too far.
Yeah, so what is the ideal? Here? No.
I know. We tried. Won't be able to record.
But if I keep the mic a little bit.
That's good. It's good.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So from the perspective of South Yemen, this is a case where the tradition basically was erased, and the two Yemens unified in 1990, and at that point emerged this unity narrative, as I call it, which claimed that both parts of Yemen suffered equally from underdevelopment. So this narrative sort of erased all the accomplishments that the southern women had before unity. So it was meant to look like that North Yemeni women had sort of similar possibilities as South Yemeni women, which was not at all the case. Before unity, South Yemeni women were involved in all public life. They were in leading positions, and after unity they were simply pushed out from the political narrative, and they were sort of replaced by what I call femocrats, meaning very often wives of prominent politicians or tribal sheikhs and sisters and that kind of people. And the state sort of co-opted the women's question by establishing a National Women's Committee, which was supposed to represent women, while there was at the same time there was a sort of indigenous long-time women's movement. It was sidelined entirely. So this revolution in South Yemen, which I'm going to talk about after the lunch break, it's one of the key elements in that revolution is a gender revolution, meaning that they want to bring women back to public life from the shadow that unity placed them, and here I read that the tradition, meaning the tradition that used to be before unity in the South, is reclaimed in order to write a new future.
I just want to address the issue of agency, because while I was doing my research, found that the more women work and push for agency, the more that governments or religious authorities or whoever are pushing back. And the pushback, when everything used to depend on the culture and on communities, I think it was easier because it wasn't a law per se. But now, they are pushing back using a law that no court can go over. Some people try to make an interpretation of that. But then it has always been something that women shouldn't have. And women are insisting on it. So the part I'm noticing is how strong the international women's movement, for example, is helping, assisting women in different places, specifically when women on the Western Hemisphere understood that gender and feminism should become feminisms, that people have a sometimes total different understanding of what feminism is and their feminism. And this is helping a little bit. However, just by looking, and I think I will mention it in my research, there is now a harsh attack on this sovereignty of women. Despite the fact that constitutions are saying something different, we find the laws are completely against the Constitution. And if women want to push back by using the law, then the law is harsher. And so I think in this workshop, I hope that I get some new ideas about some workable, something that women could successfully use to gain that sovereignty that I think at once upon a time they had. Although, albeit it was a patriarchal society, but they practiced some of that agency. For now, specifically the country I'm talking about, the Sudan, it just doesn't exist. And by law. And this is what caught my attention to this conference.
But I would take it a step further. For those of us who study, particularly court records, we're often confronted with a counterintuitive reality in that we find there are more rights upheld in the so-called tradition than in the modern period. So how exactly are we defining the modern? Are we being critical enough in our understanding of these concepts, or do we tend to accept them uncritically? The other thing is, given how much the tradition, as you yourself pointed out, has been reconstituted or radicalized, to use some of the language in the paper, to what extent can we continue to call it tradition? Is it tradition at all which exists anymore? Or is it in fact another version of modernity?
First of all, whose tradition, as Susan was saying, from whose perspective are we speaking when we speak about tradition is crucial. Why do we continue to talk about it? Not because of the existence of an essential discursive thing out there called tradition, but it is something that is complex, that is totally reinventing itself. And that is why I found my lifeboat in Raymond Williams' keywords. Simply, whatever is handed over to us that we call tradition, good or bad, or ugly. But the issue of equating, or the moral equivalency of violence, backwardedness with tradition is totally, again, a Western construct, a Eurocentric, let me be specific, Eurocentric construct. Colonial modernity was not about, again, the white man's burdens, period. But again, there were different manifestations where colonial modernity actually reinforced patriarchy, actually used men to police women. There are a whole literature of how, by the whole institution of native governmentality, this purported colonial modernity turned out to be far more oppressive than what people actually accepted as tradition. its deployment became very clear to me just a couple of days ago. We had a visitor who talked about his book called Caravans of Martyrs, about suicide bombings in Afghanistan. And he said something, he's an anthropologist, so you could expect things that just you never think about. When he talked about, okay, the seclusion of women, he said he spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, about 10 years. And he said, when people were talking about the Taliban and the fact that they are actually relegating women, they are oppressing them, they are not to be seen. As a matter of fact, this tradition was extremely useful to women because they were stressed out by the drones and the noise and the surveillance. So he was talking about conceptualization of the merging of two different transgressions over public space, that you have people from the sky and people actually welcome the fact that the Taliban was saying, okay, stay home, because they have these drones. He said the noise, the psychological effects of being surveilled by these American drones 24/7 had the tremendous, just horrible effects. So can we come to Laura Bush and say, thank you very much for rescuing, but you have to do something about these drones. So you are right, in certain pockets, tradition could be, something of some use value, I guess. And not all the modern is really, especially in colonial societies, as we have seen, for example, in African societies, other colonized societies, the fact that the little modernity by way of education, improvement of health facilities, and the selectivity with which it was done was not extremely useful. It was not in the best interest. And here again, I cite Edmund Burke, a little modernity is a dangerous thing, drink deep or taste not. I am so sorry, ya Jama'a, I have to leave. So Asma has to read her paper to me when I come back. I have been conscripted by some tradition within the institutionalized tradition.
She has to make a class visit.
That I have to pay a class ticket and produce a report today, no later than 12. So please keep me in your thoughts and prayers. Okay.
I just wanted to say I'm not sure about the extent to which the new woman is essentially new. And I think this goes back to the whole tradition versus modernity concept that we've been discussing so far. I think at least in this part of the world, tradition is often directly correlated to religion. And we've been working on putting together a website. And through some of the research we've been doing, it's been interesting to note that a lot of realities about the history of women in the Arab world is often purposely negated. For instance, it's often unknown that the first martyr in Islam has been a woman, that the Prophet's own wife was a merchant both before and after she got married to him, and that women were often present on battlefields both as fighters and as nurses. And I think this goes back to something that Professor Abusharaf mentioned in her presentation about the essentiality of education. And I think as overstated as that might seem, it is extremely important for women to be educated in the kind of history that relates to them, and I think that once that starts happening, then we can start ensuring the establishment of institutions that help women attain these rights.
Let us ask a question. If we want to effectuate a deep social changes in our society, from where to start? Shall we start from changing a tradition and be more modern? Shall we start from changing the political regimes or having more job opportunities for women in the market? I'm asking this question because, the question of modernity versus tradition have been tackled when we discuss the subjugation of women in our area almost 4 or 5 decades, more than 5 decades ago. And in my opinion, it didn't lead to anywhere, in the sense that modernity came with lots of violence against women, you know. And if I just mention one example, it comes to my mind the example of the first, what they called it at that time, the first institutional conferences, or the first Syrian conferences, in المؤتمرات التأسيسية, I think. Anyhow, and in this, you know, in the proceedings of these conferences, of course, the conferences came immediately after the high hopes that Arabs will get their independence and get a unified Arab state under Sharif bin Hussein and I don't know what at that time. So they were convening to discuss what sort of state we want to have, what sort of a unified Arab state we want to have. And I'm talking about the period of the 20s here. And it was so amazing to notice that the traditionalists, you know, the religious figures in these conferences were very pro women's rights. They defended women's rights for education, and especially sheikhs from Gaza. Now when we look at Gaza, they were defending very strongly women's right for education, and they were defending women's rights for work, you know, and they were defending women's political rights. They wanted women to participate in the political process as voters and as candidates. Those who are, you know, considered modern, Arab unionist or whatever, they oppose the traditionalists because our society is not yet ripe to see women as political activists. So this is to say that this is just one example, and I'm sure your work, Amira, about what is religion, what is Sharia, is very, very relevant to, and in you know, Reem's work about, you know, from a historical point of view, you know, the violence of the modern and the tolerance of the traditionalist. And I think, you know, these have been debated over and over again, and I thought that we are done with it. You know, we are done in the sense that, you know, the modern state, you know, the modern state brought lots of violence, not only against women, but also against lots of, you know, social and political groups in our society. And the tradition, you know, we cannot really talk about one traditional thing. Look at the tradition of Saudi Arabia. Is it separate from state's policy? You know, when they decided that we don't want to have more, you know, conservatives and more oppressive traditions, they just closed their shops with a decree in, you know, more mutawwa'in industries. And so this is to say that debating the subjugation of women or gender justice from this angle of tradition versus modernity, we need, you know, as many works have done already, it needs to problematize what is the traditional and what is the modern.
Make about this, and perhaps it goes also to my own plans or my approach to the research I'm doing right now. I think the problematic we're talking about has to do with the organization of knowledge, the production of knowledge, and the dissemination of knowledge. because we have become stuck with paradigms that we have already decided we do not accept and that they are problematic. My question is, so why are we still using these paradigms? I've stopped using modern and traditional now for a very long time. I fight very hard when I come to use a term when I'm writing to replace tradition. You know, so I use pre-modern, but then I go back and say, well, what's modern? The point is, we begin to look at a construction of a history built on periods that are also exogenous, that really reflect history from outside. We know this already, so why do we still apply it? So I'm trying my best not to apply it. In other words, you begin to swim and produce according to the scholarship and the research you are doing, rather than trying to fit within what is expected of you. And this is not easy, because it takes a very long time to sit down and say, well, I'm going to try to do it that way and see where do I go from here. But here I'm also guided by some great thinkers, a person like Foucault, who basically warned us that the biggest problem we have when we're writing is that we come with the product of today and begin to look to the sources or to the way by which we have arrived there, when in fact, every period has so many different changes taking place that the product of that period does not necessarily have anything to do with really the product of today. So as historians, and it becomes very hard, you really need to contextualize that period fully. And this is where the work of anthropologists is so important, you know, because they really teach us how to research lived realities of the particular age. And I think this is the answer where we go when we begin talking about where we're going or where we are today or how to solve the problems. We really should be focused on what is going on, and rather than be bothered with on the contrary, we should just turn our backs to this discourse and fight it and find new discourses. I don't have a new discourse. Frankly, I'm just a good historian, hopefully, that I let my material talk for me and basically see where that leads me, even if it's just narratives and stories. They tell a lot rather than having to use the big words and making it into something that academia unfortunately requires of us. And here I love Tokofu Zabiri's words, when he talks about white logic. And he's talking about social sciences and talking about the academy and really how it has formed our discourse to a point where we do not see anymore the trees from the forest. So we are so informed, we are so involved with the social sciences and fitting within what is considered to be academic and kosher and to be respected, that we are really talking a language that we can't really get out of. And he's going to be coming here later in the year, and he's a very fascinating fascinating scholar. I suggest all of you reading his book, White Logic, about this. It's about the social sciences. It's not about anything that has to do, it's got to do with race, but it's not really about race, it's really about the social sciences. So I think when one of our classes, we have a gender course that Rogaia and I have had the pleasure of had for 2 years, and the students have taught us a lot. And this is amazing when you have good students and the students are writing good papers and they're researching, you really get a lot out of them. And I remember in one of our classes, we came up with the 3 Ps, right? There were 3 Ps. The 3 Ps, these are the gender, the type of gender violence that nobody talks about. And I think this is what to do with lived realities and what Rogaia was talking about in the silences. That you have to break the silences. This is the most important thing that's happened, is breaking the silences. For societies where silence had become the means by which, gender, as we experience it, has in fact been almost permanent, and people do not talk about, because of questions of honor, for one thing, but many other reasons. And what are the 3 Ps? The 3 Ps we never talk about, prostitution. It's like we don't have prostitution. Well, it's time for most societies, particularly our societies, to talk about prostitution openly. To talk about it as something of a lived reality that has to do with the economic conditions that women have found themselves in. And this comes to a very important form of of violence that nobody talks about, and that's economic violence. You know, all you have to do is go back and read Maria Mai's accumulation on a world scale, and you'll understand that without the work of women, then you cannot have a capitalist system that we have today. But if you add prostitution to this, it's again something not talked about. I think we can begin talking about something else. Then we have pedophilia. My paper is on child marriage. We never talk about pedophilia in our societies. It doesn't exist. That's crazy. And so basically, this is another P. You know, a pedophilia that one has to. There are silences that we do not talk about, and yet today, because of the Arab Spring, I'm actually a bit more optimistic than all of you, because what we're seeing because of certain movements and the kind of radicalization and I would say the silent revolution that's taking place socially, that in fact people have become more accepting of, especially the girls are coming out to talk. And you know, the Me Too movement showed you how many people have been saying that, but that's beyond this. It's young girls who simply today do not have families that support them, that have found themselves on the streets and basically are talking. That is a lot of this happening anywhere, at least in countries like in Egypt and Sudan and in Tunis and other countries that really have had it, even with family violence against the coming out. But we do have a lot of this coming. And by the way, pedophilia is not against girls only, against little boys as well. And that is a stunning thing, and we need to write about that and not be afraid. I mean, believe me, in my generation, we couldn't talk about these things. You know, it's something that doesn't exist. You're not supposed to point to it. I think changing the agenda would do it. The last one, of course, is polygamy. You need to attack polygamy, and it has to be attacked. It's going to continue. And there are women today who really want polygamy, you know, and basically lots of societies actually see polygamy as, but in certain societies that have pedophilia and have prostitution, there shouldn't be polygamy. That's the whole, these are the 3 Ps that one should be actually talking about. So I think that there is an agenda to be put out there that we can talk about, and that is to go beyond the paradigms, you know, that especially the modern and the traditional. I know for years you've had to talk about this, and to the fact that it still continues, it just behooves me, you know. There's been so much written to, and the binaries that Rogaia talked about, I'm sorry she's not here, and these binaries, you know, between the modern and between the traditional, between the domestic scene versus the public scene, all of this I've taken out of my writing. It's not ours. Let's not talk about it. There's no reason for it. It's already being resolved. It was a problem, but it's been resolved. We had to deal with it. It's been resolved. So let's try differently. Let's talk about women in public life. Let's write about that. Let's focus about how women actually live, as we're doing in this webpage, and Nadine actually is the spirit behind this. The material that we're getting out shows women in a different way, and we want to do that, is to show women as existing in every aspect of life. So we organize knowledge differently. That's my point. We begin by organizing it differently than it's been done for us. By the way, I don't have an organization. I'm saying this is where we go. You know, together we can come out with a new way of seeing things. Now, how to disseminate it is a bigger problem. You know, so we're doing this young web page. God only knows, lots of web pages, and they're wonderful. But there must be other ways. We must be more innovative. I personally am out of my league when it comes to technology, but I think that's the future. We've got to have some way to get our thoughts out, because you write a book, you write a good article, how many people are reading it? And in what language? We are really, really handicapped. And how do we do it? I have no idea. But there must be ways by which we can actually disseminate this kind of material and thoughts and excellent work that everybody is doing. I don't even know how to use Twitter, to be honest with you. So
I know what it is, but I don't know how to work it.
There's one last thing I wanted to just raise, because it's kind of funny, and that's when Islah said new woman women are talking about. I mean, the young prince in Saudi Arabia now is talking about robots, and they just gave a nationality to the first woman robot. So where are we going? I mean, what's the new woman we're looking at? Is a robot? Is that what they're looking for as the ideal woman? Is this what this you know, they don't know what to do with the woman question, so now they're creating a woman robot. So either you become a robot or a robot's going to take your place. I don't know, I was just thinking that way crazily when you said that. So what's the new woman that they are looking for? I have absolutely no idea. And are we going to let others decide what the new woman is, or do we begin, you know, writing ourselves or doing a response to that? I don't know, but this to me is what happened in the last week is, to me, it's tremendously disturbing. That we are now being given the image of robotics, and it looks grand, it looks modern, it looks whatever, technologically advanced, but here we have not a male who's talking, not a female robot, and they're giving her the first time as a robot. So this is gender, by the way. All the symbols are right there. So what happens with...
We have a fatwa on who is it to get married to a different species. So.
Do you think? Fatwa and everything. So anyway, so I just wanted to go to that. If I may just answer the Constitution. Constitutions are a trap. The Constitutions are written by different forces. And the different forces have different interests. And even though the language may appear to be pro, you really have to take a look. I've worked on the new Egyptian constitution, as far as that's concerned, and basically you're going to find additions there that suit different parties. It's a compromise. And therefore, if you don't have the leverage, the constitutions, even though they guarantee women rights, are always going to work against women in the final analysis. You know, the only way to fight, however, is to actually take the parts of the Constitution that could help women and then sue, go to court and sue. This is what the Americans did. There's a nice book called The Rights of Women. It tells you the history of the Americans fighting for this. They used the First Amendment as a way of going to court and fighting case after case after case, back again until they make a breakthrough. And we haven't done that yet. Our lawyers do it, but very quietly, and they're usually put in prison because they succeed. I mean, Azza Suleiman is one example here. But the thing is, that that's the way to go, is to actually put it into practice. And we don't put it into practice enough to sit and take one case and go after it, go after it, go after it. You lose, find out, then you go in again. Why fight the decision of the court? And you follow this. It takes time, it takes years, but this is how, if you read The Rights of Women, this is really how the American women finally, after they lost the amendment, Equal Rights Amendment, by one vote, by the way, then they changed tactics and began to use the rights that do exist in the Constitution to bring different rights out. So that's a possible path. I'm going to speak today about child marriage. And in this paper, I'm going to try to do two things. First, to theorize about the reasons behind child marriage. And I'm, in this case, proposing a thesis that has to do with the role of the clergy, okay? So I'm talking about the discourse that perpetrates this. And at the end, I'm going to try to put a little bit of my own input on how we can deconstruct this if we are going to be able to fight child marriage. In a way, my paper is a continuation about the debate we've had this morning regarding culture, because I'm actually pointing to, culture as being blamed for a child marriage, but I'm trying to show who perpetrates culture and who is the enabler, and therefore that we can actually blame it on culture, but it goes beyond that question. The title of my paper is Child Marriage as Gender Violence. Gender inequality and the lack of emphasis on human rights can be said to be at the heart of child marriage. Inequalities of every type, from cultural to economic, are driving forces for the continuation of the practice and its resistance to change. Poverty, the lack of education, culture, religious beliefs, and socioeconomic insecurity facilitate and enforce the practice. This presentation focuses on the persistence of the practice and resistance to change in Egypt and the Arab world. I want to begin my presentation by a quotation from a video by Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, one of the new generation of Azhari sheikhs, the Azhar being the supreme constitutionally recognized authority in religious affairs in Egypt. The occasion of this quote is the announcement of Egypt's 2017 census, which showed Egypt's population to have reached 104 million people living in an area of land that could support a population of 30 million. That Egypt's #1 problem is its overpopulation goes undisputed, although some still think that the more the people, the greater the availability of working hands and hence the cheaper labor and greater productivity. Needless to say, it is the same people who advocate this type of argument who are for child marriage. The connection between economics and social construction is very clear when it comes to issues related to gender. What to do to limit population growth in a country claiming to be looking to future development to benefit its people and increase their welfare has occupied a lot of minds lately. One of the answers was to limit early marriage and hence early motherhood, a means that would slow down birth of new babies and perhaps act as a control for another big problem, and that is street children. Children left out in the streets to fend for themselves due to their families' inability to support them, including children of incest and rape who are unwanted. While efforts are exerted to find ways to fight child marriage, TV discussions, parliamentary bills, although there we find those who actually want to lower the marital age. Doctors explaining and campaigning using health facts and statistics about the harm early marriage causes young girls, stories of young girls that they were willing to come forth with to show the suffering they went through, the studies and statistics published showing early divorce as a result of early marriage, and so on, with clear government support in that direction. One would have expected the Azhar to follow or at least use fiqh al-maslaha to come up with some fatwa fitting with maslahat al-ibad, but that was hoping too much, and the response actually points to the main reason why child marriage still continues to exist, since the Azhar becomes the #1 enabler of the practice. Poverty may be why fathers do it, misogyny and women hatred may be at the heart of the practice, but religious authority legitimizes child marriage, making it almost impossible to weed out. In a debate on Egyptian TV, Sheikh Abdullah justified what medieval fuqaha say regarding the marriage of younger girls. He says, one can refer to the Prophet's marriage to Aisha when she was 9 years old, or Amr ibn al-As's marriage to an 11-year-old from whom he begot a child at that age, but that is not the point. The point is that the fuqaha talked about tutiq dhalika urfan. In other words, that she is physically able to withstand the marriage and that it fits with tradition. So no one can say that Islam requires that a girl be married at this early age as they did in Jahiliyyah time. But if the mental and physical ability of a girl, that is the word tutiq, he repeats it, that is she's able to stand it, then she can be married at that early age. He goes on to explain that the marriage or rape of a small girl, if she is samina, plump, and mentally able to withstand it, is acceptable according to the fuqaha. Allowed even if premenstrual, if the conditions exist, and that age is not the issue, but her ability to have sexual intercourse and in according to tradition or. Mind you, this just happened, and basically it's 2017. This is by a young sheikh of Azhar, like in his 30s, 40s, and so the debate is alive. We're not talking about some, old person talking here. Another sheikh, in this case a very old guy, agrees with the above and insists that it has to do with ability. Religion does not state any age for marriage. There could be a 15-year-old who is thin and scrawny and unable to stand marriage, while another is 9 and big like a wall and can have intercourse. Conclusion, a child, even an infant, can be married if she can stand the fahr. So the older and the younger generations actually agree. And I think this is pretty important, unchangeability. It is the same discourse that continues. When it came to Sheikh al-Azhar, he was caught between satisfying the state's wish to curb population growth and the insistence on reading Sharia exclusively through the eye of medieval fiqh, something the Azhar and the body of the clergy have held on to, notwithstanding pressures, i.e. the authority of medieval schools they see as representative of Islamic law, their interpretations to be applied like the gospel, and their authority not to be questioned. Okay, this is Sheikh al-Tayyib, the head of the Azhar. This is what he had to say. He determined that there is no clear text in the Quran or in the prophetic Sunnah permitting the marriage of a minor girl. He could, and my point here is he could have stopped here and ended the debate, thereby supporting a later age for the marriage of girls, but that did not happen. Continued, Islam did not specify a particular age. Islam left it to the habits and traditions and the living or contextual conditions, which could be different from place to place and time to time and civilization to civilization. He continued that Islam is a religion of rahmah, mercy, and would never wish harm for anyone, and hence would not allow the marriage of a young girl. Marriage, after all, is about emotional security between husband and wife and of takafu between them. And when religion allowed the marriage of minors, it was from within societies that accepted and were proud of the practice. He finishes by indicating that to say Islam legislated for the marriage of minors is a mistake, but the matter is about traditions and should be left to them. Studies undertaken in most Muslim countries have shown that the most important reason for the persistence of the marriage of minor girls has to do with traditions and the belief among people that Islam supports such practices. Without question, the sayings of the clergy support this, notwithstanding efforts to put the blame on traditions and away from Islam. Some continue to show that Islam actually legislates for the marriage of minors, so the Azhari sheikhs think that they are being very enlightened by leaving it to custom. The Egyptian clergy quoted here are a mirror of the clergy in much of the Islamic world. TV programs with a conservative religious bent are filled with clergymen speaking about the necessity of marrying girls at an early age and more misogynistic attitudes toward women, giving legitimacy to traditions and increasing the power of the clergy on populations looking for some sort of leadership in their everyday life. One should add that it is not only in the Arab world that the numbers of child brides is high. It is estimated that there are 14 million minor girls married each year worldwide, with India in the lead. In Africa, the tradition is widespread, reaching 8% in Niger, Chad, Ethiopia, and Guinea. Even in the USA, the numbers are high, and studies have shown the persistence of the practice. In the Arab world, 1 out of every 7 girls is married before she reaches the age. There are no clear numbers for Saudi Arabia. Some reports put it over 5,000 per year, while others deny the existence of any but rare cases. Still, the marriage of children is traditional to Saudi tribes, and the efforts of the Saudi Arabian government to limit the habit is frustrated by fatwas permitting the practice. As the government introduced a law to control the marriage of young girls by acquiring her approval, her mother's approval, and the testimony of a woman physician that the child is able to withstand the marriage, the Mufti of Saudi Arabia, the late Sheikh Abdullah al-Sheikh, responded by declaring that to say that girls cannot be married before they reach the age of 15 or less is a mistake. The female, once she reaches 10 or 12, is ready for marriage, and whoever considers her too young is mistaken and does her an injustice. From these words, one assumes that the advocates of early marriage see this as a right for the young child, notwithstanding the clear harm that befalls them, and the fact that they are coerced or cajoled into a status that they understand little about. The girl's afaf, safeguarding her purity and getting rid of the burden of financially supporting the girl, seem to be voiced by those asked from Yemen to Egypt as an answer to why marry the young girls. With breakdown in family values, economic hardship, social problems like widespread drug use, and increasing levels of poverty, girls are married off early, often to men much older, and more often than not for dowries that the family needs. Various forms of marriage have appeared to fulfill these purposes, including strange forms dubbed tourist marriage, involving older, richer men looking for a young bride to enjoy during their vacations without strings attached. Children of such marriages are very often named after the girl's father, since the marriage cannot be recognized given the age of the girls. The problems are complicated and of many types beyond the physical harm to the girl and the fact that early childbirth very often ends up in the death of the child and of the mother. In one story, a young girl said in an interview that she was unable to get vaccination for her newborn child since the marriage was illegal due to her age, so the child was named after her grandfather. These stories are widespread enough that an Egyptian MP is presenting a bill in the Egyptian National Assembly to lower the age of marriage so that children of girls under age can register their children and they would be able to go to schools and receive various government benefits. Egypt follows international agreements in regards to setting the marriage age of both girls and boys at 18. There's a contradiction between the law, what the law says, and what the practices are. There is a political side to the story, perhaps a less well-acknowledged one. It appears with radical groups and those calling for the establishment of Islamic states. Here, early marriage, a domestic role for women, early childbirth to increase the numbers of followers and fighters for the cause become part of a political, religious discourse. Here we can mention what Khamenei, great guide of the Islamic Republic of Iran, had to say. Woman means the highest product and commodity in the world of humanity. He said this in a context of a calling for a return to the principles that have been destroyed by the West, a West with devious plans against Islam. Those who fight early marriage use Satan, and those calling for equality for women are Zionists calling for the destruction of society. It's quoting him. This type of rhetoric is repeated by Hezbollah leader Sheikh Nasrallah of Lebanon. Birth control is declared a sin, and those who practice it sinners. Muslims are called upon to marry off their daughters while young and to increase population numbers. The image of Fatima, daughter of the Prophet Muhammad and mother of Al-Hussein, as the image of the mother who sacrificed everything for child and people, is invoked by these clerics as much as the name of Aisha, Prophet Muhammad's wife, is invoked in support of early marriage by Sunni clerics. In short, religious discourse supported and pushed by the ulama, particularly those connected with political power, enables and justifies child marriage. This discourse is answerable from within the very same sources, stories, and Islamic traditions that these clerics use. The chapter on pre-Islamic and early Islamic marriage in the book I am writing on history of marriage, a research in primary sources of that period, raised questions regarding our understanding of that early period, calling attention to the need for a closer reading of these sources. The Prophet's family figures strongly in fiqh literature. Their life experiences present principles to follow when determining how Muslims should act today. Emphasis on early marriage, seclusion, and domesticity seem to lace clerical discourse, yet a reading of the actual lived realities of these women gives a different perspective, calling us to do more research about actual life and away from discourse, which represents more the ideas of its producer than of the world he is writing about. To begin with, at the time of the Prophet Muhammad's first marriage to Khadija, she was purported to have been anywhere from 36 to 40 years old and had been twice married before. She gave him 6 children, which may confirm her earlier age. He is said to have been 15 to 20 years her junior. It was also Khadija who sought the hand of the Prophet in marriage, a fact reported by his biographers without any surprise, seemed to have been normative. Within the Prophet's family, Ali bin Abi Talib first refused Caliph Umar bin Khattab's suit of his daughter Kulthum's hand in marriage because of her young age. He finally agreed because of Umar's insistence to cement his relationship with the Prophet's family through marriage to Kulthum, granddaughter of the Prophet through her mother Fatima. Notwithstanding this example, most cases related to the Prophet's seerah are of later marriage for women, and this includes most marriages of the Prophet himself, as well as his successor, Abu Bakr, and his wife, who were 21 and 18 respectively at the time of marriage. This was also the case for Fatima, Kulthum's mother, who was 18 at the time of her marriage to Ali. Ali was 20. But it is the Prophet's marriage to Aisha bin Abi Bakr which reinforces the belief that girls were married quite young among Arabs. According to the accepted story, she was a child of 6 at the time of her betrothal, and the marriage was consummated when she was 9, post-menstruation. Since the Sunnah of the Prophet constitutes the second source of law for the Sharia, those holding to a patriarchal outlook continue to hold on to this story as basis for an early age of marriage as being permitted or even preferable. Today, millions of girls in the Islamic world are sold into early marriage based largely on prophetic hadiths. Just to read one of them, It is reported from Aisha that she said, "The Prophet entered into marriage with me when I was a girl of 6, and at the time of joining his household, I was a girl of 9 years of age." In 2015, publicly contradicting this story was one of the issues taken against the Egyptian researcher Islam al-Bahiri, who received a prison sentence for disrespect to Islam, Izdira al-Adyan, because of his criticism of fiqh tradition, in this case al-Bukhari. Yet as far back as 1946, Maulana Muhammad Ali determined that Aisha was 14 when she married the Prophet. Since then, researchers have shown that Aisha was anywhere between 9 and 19 at the time of her marriage to the Prophet, and she was in fact betrothed to someone else before him, evidence that she must have at least reached puberty when betrothed. Some of the evidence to a late marriage focused on the fact that Aisha was 10 years younger than her sister Asma, who was 27 years of age at the time of Hijrah to Medina in 622. This means that Aisha was 17 or 18 in 622. The Prophet married Aisha after the 622 Hijrah. Those who confirm Asma's age do so on the basis of her death in 63 AH, following the death of her son Abdullah bin al-Zubair, who was killed by the troops of the Caliph Abdul Malik bin Marwan after having revolted against Umayyad rule and declared himself Caliph in Medina. Asma was 100 years old at the time of her death. This means she was 28 at the time of Hijrah in 622. One should also ask that if the Prophet married Aisha when she was 9 years old and he died in 632 when she was 16, how could it be that he was also known to say, "Take half your religion from this woman," and that she became a respected theologian who is said to have been the narrator of 2,200 hadiths? As an adult woman, this type of acknowledgement and ability would be expected, but it is hard to accept this if she had been 9 years old and still playing with dolls, as Bukhari's hadith confirming this early marriage purports. To conclude, economic factors are at the heart of the continuation of child marriage, but traditions cannot be discounted. Rather, traditions have been the basis upon which Muslim states have resisted change and constitute the number one reason for the reservations to CEDAW, limiting the application of human rights to women. In this study, I tried to show the connection between religious discourse and the continuation of traditions and of child marriage, and see that it is by deconstructing this discourse that the road toward ending or at least curbing child marriage could be achieved.
The question is, if Abu Tayyib, the one who produced the is that still a site of contestation? I mean, majority of the people who attacked still are of the view that she was 9 years old. So wouldn't that put the burden on people who will give away the child in marriage, for example? To say, okay, the majority confirmed that she was 9, it was a sunnah, yet they are not in transgression of a prophetic tradition. Who is listening to Abu Tayyib? Already made clear about the opposition. But do you think that, or in what way do you think that other people are using Abu Tayyib to try to effect some changes in child marriage?
I'm not saying that he's saying that. In fact, the man said, yes, that Aisha's age was 16, but he still is confirming traditions. He ends up by confirming traditions. And when you ask most people, they say religion says child marriage and traditions. So basically saying you have to apply the urf, whatever the urf is. So if there's a place where you have 16 years, in another place you would have 10 is acceptable. That is the dilemma that we have here. And they always go back to the sunnah of the Prophet as being the basic. What we've seen lately, for example, with the whole question of driving in Saudi Arabia, is that the same sheikhs, and some of the people are doing it on the internet and it's very effective, which comes back to the dissemination of knowledge we talked about earlier. And that is, they're showing the same sheikhs saying that it is against God's will that women drive. The same sheikhs today are coming out and saying that it is acceptable for women to drive. And I think this is really what's happening. There's a shift happening, but it calls upon us to do more, to do more of deconstructing. Because in many cases, even the case about the Tunisians with the marriage of a Muslim woman to a Christian man, or a non-Muslim man, all of a sudden the shiuch are coming and saying, no, there's nothing in the Quran that says you can't marry a Christian man. To me, that was a big shock. You know, basically all of us were very surprised. And basically, this is an absolute no-no, but in front of material that was brought up by a lot of the muftis in Tunisia and other places and women who have been doing work on this, the shiuch have begun to say, well, yeah, there is nothing in the Quran that says so, but traditions are against this. And that women will be treated badly because if the husband is not a Muslim, he will not be able to treat a Muslim woman. So we have a change in discourse from making it legitimate, or let's say that it's religion that forbids, it's haram, you're going to go to hell if you marry a non-Muslim, to now it is better for you not to do that. So, but it needs a lot of deconstruction to be done. That is, here I just tried a small thing with child marriage, but every one of these issues, it's the clerical discourse that needs to be deconstructed. This is what I'm pointing out here. Because consistently it has been problematic throughout and perpetrated, you know, matters that we need to, the woman's right to work, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot that can be done. I wrote a paper about this that was published, and in it I began the paper by discussing work contracts that were written in Jordan in the 17th century. Rogaia is familiar with these, where they were renting out the little girls, 10-year-old or 12 years old, to work 10 years in a male household, male-dominated, and the contract was being written by the father, being signed by a Sharia court judge, and they didn't see anything wrong with this, with sending this girl under the authority of a male who's paying in advance for her. And basically they didn't see anything wrong or immoral about such an act. So it isn't a question of women not leaving their home and going to work. It was more of a class issue where the ulama were really writing about their own sisters and their own daughters, etc. That's the fiqh they were addressing. Not about as for women of a different class, they had a different fiqh. But this is something we don't talk about, and I try to problematize that in that paper. So, yeah, I think at this present, maybe in 10 years, we don't need to do this anymore, but at this point in time, we really need more people to deconstruct, to go in and look at what the fuqaha are saying as discourse and begin to deconstruct it from within the sources, from within, not just what the Quran says, but also the lived realities. The lived realities, fiqh is relived reality. They're really reacting to how people live. That's how I look at it, rather than looking at it as being theology, to be this is the way of saying this is what should be applied. But when they say so, they're also saying what exists. Fatawi as well. Fatawi is about problems being brought up, and they're usually unique problems, and they're telling you about particular cases. If we use these to consistently break down the discourse, that may be a way forward. I'm not saying it's a guaranteed way, but I think it's happening already. We've seen it in several cases, just right now with the driving, with the whole thing about inheritance is a bit more difficult, although it's happening there too, and that is to show a different, let's say a different theology, if you want, using the same sources, not even outside sources.
Thank you, Amira, for the fascinating presentation as usual. I'm just, reacting to what have been said about the persistence of clerical discourse on child marriage in general. If I take this back to the context from where I come, 10 years ago, yes, we used to hear, especially in Gaza, and it's not a coincidence that it happens, or it used to happen mostly in Gaza, where, where the poverty level is much higher than in the West Bank. But now, after 10 years, and with the persistence of the women's movement to fight child marriage as a form of violence against girls, there have been some new law reforms that in fact criminalize, this act. So it is almost impossible now to hear any clerical discourse legitimizing, child marriage. But if we look at it from not from the paradigm of tradition or religion or Sharia, and look at a situation like in Syria. This practice was almost, vanishing, especially in urban centers and also to some extent in rural areas. Again, because of the state's policy that prohibited, this practice. And look at Syria now in the 21st century, with a country torn apart with a civil war, and the mushrooming of these groups of radical Islamists legitimizing the practice for themselves and also for the community they govern. So I would say, yes, part of it is it always exists, in the religious discourse, but also the religious discourse is not one single discourse. I remember here, for example, first of all, Muhammad Abdu, and then you have Mahmoud Shaltut, and they had completely different discourse. And they were also very influential when it comes to their, intervention about some important social issues. So this is just to try to not to unify the religious discourse, and that there is always a need to deconstruct it from within, but also not to see it as one thing, solid, closed one thing, beside the factors that affect the societies, that in some moments they find this practice as completely inhumane and against the religion, and when the society, the societies change, whether with the rise level of poverty or political oppression or the dismantlement of the state control, we see this practice re-emerging again. And of course the flagrant example, maybe Susanne will talk about it, is in Yemen. In Yemen, and the trafficking of child girls, because there is a huge market, it seems, in Saudi Arabia for this. So when we talk about huge market, it means poverty, not really, religious beliefs, in general. Thank you.
No, I actually agree with you. And in fact, as I said earlier, there's this Salafi trend that is applied, but there's a dialectic going on, because there's many sheikhs that speak against this. For example, if you take Sheikh Qaradawi, it's a wonderful quote that comes from him. And he basically says that he doesn't deny the fact that Islam didn't set the age of marriage, but he takes the opposite direction. And he says that it's up to the Majlis al-Alami to actually make fathers wake up to the harm that is going to happen to their girls regarding their early marriage. And Jifri, etc. There are lots of people who do that. The problem is that we have such a huge trend of, on the other side, that fathers who want to continue the practice find the excuse. And then we see them particularly not on the very highly educated ulama class, who know better, people like Dr. Qaradawi and so on, who are willing to make the transition. But in the more common level of ulama, in the mosques, everywhere else, and more importantly, the ulama inside the clergy inside the small villages, this is where they are. And they're the ones who, the ma'zoon who is not allowed today, they're passing laws to criminalize the ma'zoon signing a marriage of a minor, but it doesn't stop, The percentages are horrendous, So I'm saying that, yes, I agree with you, there's a whole lot, and this is why it's doable. In fact, in the case of Tunis, it's the Mufti who came out and showed all they couldn't fight the Mufti of Tunis when he stood up and said the Quran says nothing about the marriage of of a Muslim woman to a Christian woman. So it's got to come from within the ulama class. And by exposing the ulama as being at one changing their minds, you begin to make the alim stick more to true Islam or to a different interpretation of Islam than the ones that they're coming up with. Anyway, it's all dialectical. There's no one way. But I'm calling for us to be part of this, to push that agenda, since we've been talking about it, do our bit by doing more of that sort of research. Thanks. Islam.
I have two questions. So the first question is about the change in discourse that you mentioned, that was driven by certain ulama, whether they're Azhari or the Tunisian Mufti. I think that such change in the discourse is a result of revisions or deconstruction of discourse, or actually they're just political maneuvers by these ulama in order to hold on to remnants of a power they once had. These political maneuvers, at times we find these ulama are aligning with the state, and at other times we see them aligning themselves with other religious and political actors in the state. And this takes me to my second question: which discourse are we ought to deconstruct? Don't you think that religious authority has been significantly decentralized in the Arab world? That there isn't really a one discourse, there has been a chaos in contemporary fiqh in the Middle East?
Yeah, there's been, it is a case, as you say, but I think there have been trends all along. I personally am working on Salafism as being a trend that existed, we were discussing before you came, that existed since the time of the founding of the Abbasid Empire and Imam Malik's, Mansur's request to Imam Malik to create al-Musnad, with which he would rule, the looking backwards, to trying to always fit with what could have happened, the law, to try to legalize. This has been a tradition, to always try to stick to the text of the law. We always forget textualization, that what exists as text was oral at one time, and therefore can be contextualized for a particular period. The problem is once they put the text down, it became gospel. It became, and therefore we have always want to be safe. We have to go back to the time when the text was written and stick to that particular text. So we've always had this dialectic going on, and that is how to stick to the text and how to interpret it in a new way. This is nothing new within Islam. Throughout Islamic history, that has been the actual truth. It's how we begin to write about it today. So we write about it in such a way to show that this has always been one truth, that the text has applied everywhere else. Actually, that's not true. There's always been textualization, retextualization taking place. It's always going back to the Salafism as a method, not necessarily as truth, even though we think that the product of Salafism today is the truth. It's actually a product of this dialectic that is taking place. So in dialectics, you always have a group coming out of a group. So basically you have two power struggles, or two classes clashing, and then a new thought coming out. So it's normative that alim who belonged will, like if you take Sha'rani, for example, Sheikh Sha'rani, when the Ottomans came into Egypt, he was the Sufi leader. But then after that, when you see his writings, he is a complete, radically writing against the coming of the Ottomans because they took away all the privileges of the ulama at the time. So this is normal, that's dialectic, that you could be of one trend, but what you have is it's usually people like that. So I don't look at it as being self-serving. I think the problem with political scientists is they're always looking for, that are they doing this self? Of course they're self, they're human. A human being is always going to be self-serving. It's not going to be, it's part of what he produces as thought, is who he is, what he's, is part of it. This I think is what makes Islamic history exciting. That is, it's always in flux. And it's one of the reasons why I don't teach Middle East Civ anymore. Is because of the narrative that is supposed to be textualized and that you have to give it as is. When in fact, I know as I grew older and I learned more and read more that there is no such thing, that there's 1,000 narratives out there. And therefore it is better for me to work with my students on these narratives and let them know that there's 1,000 narratives rather than tell them this is the narrative, you have to eat it up. That's Salafism. But we've always had that trend that we need to emphasize. And this is what I mean by we need to change the discourse. We need to get this message out that there is multiplicity of thoughts. See what I mean? That there is no such thing as a permanent text, except for the Quran, of course. But everything else is itself a product of narrative. It's a product of orality. It's a product of thought. For us to accept it. And you know, the thing that bugs me is most of these ulama have only read one book. You know, they've only read a bunch of books or one particular, let's say, piece of work, and they refer to it on and over again. That's why you're going to find 100 sheikhs who graduated from the Azhar, who are from Indonesia all the way to Morocco, saying the exact same response to any question you ask. It's because of the text that they were given to learn by heart and to go out and that's Salafism at its best. So this is really what I'm pointing out. That yeah, I would agree with you that these ulama are for or against, but that's nothing new. From the very early times, you look at the debate between the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris, and it's right there. It hasn't changed. We have the same things until today. Great. Any other questions? Or we move to, yeah.
Yeah, my comment is not about Yemen, but rather the other country where child marriage is still prevalent, and that's United States. If you know that only, was it last year, North Carolina introduced legislation which abolished the child marriage, but there are still several states where it is fully legal, and the rationalizations are very similar to this, that you have to protect, you have to give for the family the possibility to marry a minor girl who has been raped or who has made the sort of a mistake of having sex.
Sorry, but it's my husband, so.
So what I mean is that this is not an Islamic issue, child marriage, and I think it's very important to raise the fact that it's a current practice in USA. While in Europe we very often hear that this is one of the sort of arguments against Islam and Muslims, that we cannot sort of possibly have these people because their habits are so out of so different from ours. And then we have USA. And now very few people. Which one of you knew that child marriage is legal in the US?
They have a very big,
they
have a good program on it with BBC. There's a big article on this that just came out that actually shows, it's shocking to show that how widespread it is in the United States. It's not just in the Islamic world. It exists everywhere. You know, I'm reminded of a case I never forget that was written about in the Egyptian newspapers around maybe 8 or 9 years ago, where a young girl, she was 13, and she became impregnated by her boyfriend who was in medical school. And so her father went to the police and complained. So they brought the boy, and they told him, you know, you're going to marry her. And the father came and said, absolutely not. I'm prosecuting him, he goes to prison. And you should have seen the outcry in the newspapers and by the people. She is destroying his career. He is going to be graduated from a medical school, etc. And the father insisted that, and the boy actually went to prison for its rape for a 13-year-old. But, and they said, but your daughter is pregnant, blah, blah. I said, it's our problem, not yours. So if more parents, this is the kind of story that needs to be, you know, brought out and talked about to show that you could stand with the child, but it took a particular kind of father to do that. They never said their name in the newspapers, that should tell you, but still, everybody found her and her family mistaken, not the boy. So, anyways, thank you very much. Okay, yeah, please.
The United Nations Convention with the age of marriage set the age of marriage for girls at 16, but for boys at 18.
I think it's 18 for both.
No, 16 for girls. I thought it was 18 for both.
Egypt applied, and most countries, even here in Qatar, it's 18 following the...
Yeah, the laws, the country laws differ. Some people don't pay attention to the United Nations. Others, the United States itself, where now it turned out to be hundreds of thousands are marrying.
Yeah,
18.
I don't know how many of the states in the United States do not have a minimum age for marriage. So actually,
They set the minimum age for marriage for girls 16. And for
in
boys,
Virginia, you can marry your daughter at any age. Sheikh, what's his name, should move there. Who's advocating this on television?
that's what, but well, over there they consider the United Nations is infringing their sovereignty, so they don't pay attention. It is made for us.
Out.
He will.
Great, thank you so much. Susanne, all yours.
Okay, so before I start, my paper is actually published in this book, which I'm going to circulate here. So, Freedom Without Permission: Bodies and Space in the Arab Revolutions, edited by Francis Hasso and Zakia Salim. I'm going to take you to the what they call revolution squares in South Yemen, the area that the activists these days call South Arabia. I'm suggesting that it's a gender revolution that is taking place there, but then at the same time it's a silenced revolution, meaning that well, to start with, the war in Yemen is silenced. There are many reasons for that, but then what happens inside the country is sort of silenced from the perspective that the so-called international community believes that the southern disagreement with Sana'a should be sort of settled within the unified country, while actually Southerners are really fed up with the whole idea of unity and want to sort of reclaim their independence. So you can see that the cityscape sort of, or the public space is taken over by this revolutionary movement. They have replaced the pictures of the hated president and commercial billboards with the pictures of their own martyrs. So my photos are from Aden, from the big city and capital of South Yemen, from 2013. That's the last time I was able to go there because of violence. This revolution started there already in 2007, so it's an uprising that precedes the 2011 uprisings, and basically throughout 2013 they had this disobedience days. Meaning that they closed the shops, schools, most government offices in order to protest against the regime. And this took place right before the war, meaning that this sense of reclaiming independence has only increased since the war, because the war is perceived as a north-south war in the south. So this is one of the one government office which was closed. Here I'm attending a funeral which was held in the main street, and for 3 pilots who had been killed. And these are all crimes that the so-called legitimate regime of Yemen has committed. I'm standing in this balcony. We were invited to a home there to observe the funeral, and these 2 guys are young reporters. The funeral procession then started to go through the city, and then it became like a revolution rally. This is one of the organizers, this young woman of the funeral. Here we are going to a big rally, sort of nationwide rally, which they called Millionaire, Million Man rallies, and these guys are coming from the very east, border of Oman, and these guys too. While these are young guys from the capital, meaning that these different social groups unite in these revolution squares to design change. So I'm standing in the platform of that rally together with female participants, because in all these rallies and these revolution squares, the best seats were always reserved for women. So this is the ladies' sort of part. This woman was the head of the medical team of the rally. And then this is in a poor neighborhood in the downtown Old Aden called Crater. And they had every Thursday a rally there, and very often always they had some speakers. This time they had also a member of the ulama there. And here I met one member of the Fuqaha who explained to me that the movement had actually set up a committee to review all the Yemeni legislation from the Islamic perspective, because basically in Sana'a this argumentation against the South has always included the argument that the Southerners are lesser Muslims, and that the rule that they had before unity was sort of out of Islam. So they are tackling that problem too. These rallies and demonstrations always gather all social strata, so meaning from the very poor people to intellectuals and professionals. And then, of course, we have this revolutionary sort of imaginary or international imaginary of revolutions present there too. This is the first time young people have become politicized, and including also young women. And this young woman was 17. She told me that her entire family has joined the movement, and they are first time sort of politically active. And in these rallies, the men always keep sort of good guard that women are sort of feeling okay in being there, meaning that they are always giving chairs, and then when the procession goes through the souk, the men go and buy cold water and give it to the women, and in particular for women who have children with them. So the men are really sort of making an effort to make the public space again inviting for women. And I'm saying again because before unity, women were very active in the public square. But then when unity came, this traditionalist thinking spread from North Yemen, and women withdrew home. They never came again to there basically wasn't very much public events where they could attend, and they became very unhappy. Many women actually started to chew cud because they said that there's nothing else to do. So these revolution squares, they have set up them in each part of the city. Some of them have been demolished, including this one, by tanks. And this is the committee who was running that activities in that square. The two young women were the most, or the leading figures here. And this is another square again, and this is where, in particular, intellectuals came. And it was an evening where there were two authors speaking, and then they invited me to speak also there. And as you can see, the women had the front seats here. Then, because social media is very important for today's activities, this guy, the second from right, Khaled, I got to know him through Facebook first, and then one day I met him in the street, and he turned out to be a key person in organizing these events there, because during the civil disobedience days there was a lot of violence because the army tried to penetrate the area, and the young boys were running against them and throwing stones. And this guy was the only one who had a car, so he was acting like as a voluntary ambulance man. He was shot dead in 2015, December. These are from the streets. So basically, what this movement is doing, it's reclaiming the city. It's reclaiming the public space from the violence that the regime represents, and it has taken the form also of several one-person initiatives to improve the community and to run communal services which are not at all sort of functioning since years. Here we have some tear gas, and when I took this photo, I had inhaled this horrible gas, and since I had been in Tahrir earlier, I had the experience of Egyptian tear gas and then this one. And it was quite different because in Egypt they use really tear gas, meaning that you start crying. But in Yemen, you stop breathing when you inhale this. One of my friends was killed by this tear gas, and I was in big trouble because I thought that my breathing stops here, but then for some reason I could sort of reclaim my breathing. Well, basically, so this is the army coming to them. They have this full equipment, and whom they meet are these guys, many of them without any shoes. So it's like David and Goliath sort of really fighting there. Then we have young women on the rooftops looking down, panicked what's happening there, what has happened to perhaps her brother. And that morning when I took these photos, the army entered this Revolution Square that we saw a bit earlier, and they tear everything down. So they started to repair everything there, and this boy was shot that morning, and immediately they made a poster to him. The next Thursday they reorganized and came back with the activities there, and I met this old lady there who was the grandmother of that boy who was shot. So I mean, it was really really difficult moment to meet a person whose grandson has been killed. But she came there because as I could realize that these squares were very important for people, because they were not only squares to show protest and anger, but also to get comfort and care. So that, this is what I'm suggesting in my paper, that this is the sort of intimate civil politics that that you have in South Yemen in these squares. So to come to the end of my paper, the next Thursday when the boy was killed, and he wasn't the only one, but that particular case, grown-up people came also to the streets in order to protect the young boys. And always when I was walking there in the streets, because there are very few foreigners these days in Yemen, people were sending personal messages through me to the world, sort of, and asking me to raise the issue. Here they are sort of paralleling their struggle to Palestine and the Intifada, saying that a similar Intifada is taking place in South Yemen, but very few people actually know about it and care about it. But I'm trying to suggest that it's a very important moment, not only in Yemeni history, but also in the history of Arab world, because it's a situation that you had a better sort of situation for women, and then it was erased. And now there's a movement which is men and women together, young and old, are reclaiming that legacy to be active life again. And then that the international community are against them.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on kind of a violence that is specific to women that was caused in Yemen by the war, or don't we see a specific gendered violence?
Well, obviously in the streets, the violence doesn't look at gender, and but then at the same time, as I describe in my paper, that some of the women were quite brave in sort of confronting the armed soldiers by using their handbags or something like that, because they knew that the soldiers it would be more difficult for them to shoot an older woman rather than just some guy. And that's what they did. So the women sort of used also abuse. They abused the soldiers by words, but also that they sort of went to them and used their handbags to bang them. But then I think that what is sort of particularly important violence in Yemen is the silencing of women's capabilities, put it that way. So there is this narrative that all Yemen is as sort of backward, and that that's why you cannot introduce any changes, because the families wouldn't allow it. So it's, or that it's against our religion. So these are the two sort of frameworks that are used in order to push back any kind of legal changes. Very often it's the case that the political elites are using these women's rights as a sort of way of making politics. So at one stage in early 2000, when a group of women opposed the inclusion in the personal status code that the man has the right to send the police to bring back a wife who has left the home, basically. So the group of women's rights activists, they frame this that it's violence against women, and they appealed to the president. The president at that moment saw his possibility or chance to become sort of promoter of women's rights, and that's how he sort of stopped the law, while in other moments he has been quite definitely not an advocate of women's rights, on the contrary. So it's a game where women's rights are sort of used in making politics.
There is the famous study of Maxine Moulineux about social and economic changes happened to women in South Yemen during the revolutionary system. And she also showed that there is a sort of differences, or a sort of difference between South Yemen and North Yemen when it comes to social status of Yemeni. Do you see any remnants of this, legacy of the revolutionary era on Yemen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the tradition that I was referring to earlier, that they want to reintroduce this idea of that how they phrase it in South Yemen is that women are half the society, and that sends the message that men cannot monopolize the public sphere because women are half of it. So you can read it also that that men are only half society. So this is the sort of legacy, and the difference in principle in between North and South Yemen, it's huge. I mean, it's I'm currently writing a book manuscript on how these two parts of Yemen approach modernity from different perspectives, meaning that the kind of modernity that each part is promoting has different social consequences, meaning that which groups lose their rights if this kind of modernity is progressing. And these groups are quite different in these two parts. And I'm suggesting that within one nation state, you cannot accommodate two types of, two strategies to modernity. It's impossible because in a nation state, you're supposed to have legislation that is equal to everybody. By the way, Maxine is a friend of mine.
Asma?
One task was usually look for reasons of violence against women as it's particularly gender-based, but usually used against men. Like during conflict, you have to the women of the other side as a demoralization, as conquering them. Not paying attention to, okay, the pain they're causing the women. That doesn't count. What counts is what happens to the men who are fighting each other if you rape their women. Is there a sense of that in that conflict, the sexual violence in that conflict, or is it just random violence?
You mean the violence during the war? Or, I didn't quite understand your question.
Okay, is it there are fighting groups, right?
Yeah.
There are fighting groups.
Yeah.
There is a conflict between
Yeah.
two groups.
Yeah.
And when we look at violence against women during conflict, we usually see the fact that it was actually an act of conquering the other men. So is it just random violence, or is there something about conquering the men?
Not in that sense, because rape, for instance, hasn't been used in the current conflict. But what is particular is that female activists have been shot at and attacked simply on the basis that they are activists. So it's not the kind of violence where you want to target a male activist and then kidnap her sister or something like that, that we haven't seen in Yemen.
We ran out of time, but I have a question to, actually to three people. Susanne and then Islah, when you get to your paper, and Nadine later on, because what you were talking about is a situation where when there is war, we don't see gender conflict or violence against women except perhaps in the silence. So if I'm not mistaken, we see the same thing in Palestine, where when there is a cause, then somehow the violence against women becomes less important. And I think it's the same thing when we come to harassment. So maybe we need to problematize this and talk about why is it that when the general violence or the war comes to an end, then we begin to see the gender violence come again. Maybe I'm wrong, and in that case, I'd love all of us to actually look about this, because it's something that I think recurs, that when there is, the state is in peril, somehow the cause means you don't need to be as aggressive towards women, and certain types of violence like harassment that has always been, or rape, etc., stops to happen when there is a bigger issue, and then begins, or at least the numbers fall, and then it begins again once it's over. Why is that the case? It'd be fun of us to actually begin to think about this. Well, we're going to take 5 minutes exactly, and then we come back because Ramadan is going to be presenting for us. Thank you, Susanne.